The sea was never far from Isoroku Yamamoto's heart. Born on the 4th of April 1884, in the quiet city of Nagaoka, Japan, he entered a world still trembling from the winds of change. The Meiji Restoration had transformed Japan from a feudal archipelago into a modern empire, and the boy who would one day command fleets grew up surrounded by the echoes of cannon fire and dreams of greatness. His father, a low-ranking samurai, believed deeply in the new Japan, one that sought power through knowledge, steel, and the sea. Young Isoroku was restless, curious, and sharper than most of his peers. His family, though modest, noticed his brilliance early. He devoured books on geography, science, and the great powers of the world, particularly America and Britain. He was fascinated by ships, the glint of armor, and the hum of engines. The world was changing, and Japan was determined to keep pace. The Navy, not the Army, was the new key to survival, and Yamamoto's path soon led him to its gates. At age 20, he entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, a place of discipline, duty, and destiny. There, he quickly made a name for himself as both brilliant and outspoken. His classmates admired his intelligence but feared his stubbornness. He questioned orders, challenged assumptions, and constantly sought understanding beyond tradition. To Yamamoto, loyalty meant not blind obedience, but serving one's country with foresight and honesty even when truth hurt. His first brush with war came in 1904, when Japan went to war against Russia. The Russo-Japanese War was a defining moment, the first time an Asian power defeated a European empire in modern warfare. Yamamoto served as a young officer aboard the cruiser Nishin. At the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, Japan's navy shattered the Russian fleet, but the victory came at a price for Yamamoto. Amid the thunder of shells and the screams of the wounded, he was struck by shrapnel, losing 2 fingers on his left hand. He never forgot that day. The loss became his silent badge of honor, a reminder that glory demanded sacrifice. When the guns fell silent, the young officer returned home a hero. But inside him, something had changed. He had seen the cost of war and understood its brutal arithmetic. He also saw the power of technology and industrial might, how ships, steel, and fuel could decide the fate of nations. Japan's victory had made it proud, but also arrogant. Yamamoto knew pride was dangerous. He could already sense the shadow of overconfidence falling across the rising sun. After the war, Yamamoto's sharp mind caught the attention of his superiors. He was chosen for advanced studies first at the Naval Staff College and later in 1919 for a posting abroad. His destination would shape his entire worldview, the United States of America. When Yamamoto first set foot on American soil, it was as though he had stepped into another universe. The wide streets of Boston, the electric lights, the endless automobiles, everything pulsed with a rhythm of freedom and innovation that Japan had not yet mastered. He enrolled at Harvard University, studying economics and English, immersing himself in American culture. His curiosity was boundless. He attended baseball games, read American newspapers, and even befriended local families. He watched the country with the eyes of a naval strategist, but also the heart of a student. At Harvard, Yamamoto realized that America was more than just a potential rival. It was a sleeping giant. Its industry, resources, and human creativity dwarfed Japan's. The more he learned, the more uneasy he became. America was a nation that could afford to make mistakes and recover quickly. Japan, by contrast, was small, dependent on imported oil and steel, and dangerously proud. Yet Yamamoto admired America deeply. He loved the energy, the optimism, the informality of its people. He studied how businessmen thought, how engineers built, how politicians debated. He even picked up their slang, their habits, their humor. Some classmates remembered him as Isoroku the gentleman, polite, witty, and endlessly inquisitive. But behind his calm smile, his mind was constantly analyzing. He was not merely studying a foreign culture. He was decoding a future enemy. When his studies ended, he did not rush home. He toured American cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, observing everything. He visited factories, shipyards, and oil refineries. He saw a nation powered by engines and ambition. The vastness of it left him stunned. If Japan ever fights America, he once told a fellow officer, we will lose. It is only a matter of time. By the mid-1920s, Yamamoto had also spent time in Washington, D.C. as a naval attaché. There he met American officers, diplomats, and even ordinary citizens. He played poker with them, learned their manners, and listened to their jokes. To many, he seemed like an ally, a cultured Japanese officer with a keen interest in peace and understanding. But Yamamoto's notebooks told another story. He was calculating. Every handshake, every dinner, every conversation was a lesson in understanding how Americans thought, how they fought, and how they underestimated others. By the 1932, Japan was changing. The Great Depression had shattered economies worldwide, and militarism was rising at home. The army dominated politics, pushing for expansion into China and beyond. Yamamoto, now a senior officer, found himself caught between duty and conviction. He opposed the alliance with Nazi Germany, despised war profiteering, and warned that conflict with the United States would be suicidal. But his honesty earned him enemies. In 1939, when he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, extremist nationalists in Japan threatened his life. They saw him as too westernized, too cautious. He often received anonymous letters promising assassination. Yet Yamamoto stood firm. "If I am killed," he once said, "it will be for speaking the truth." He believed that Japan's only chance for survival lay in avoiding a war it could not win. But history was already moving toward its storm. Japan's invasion of China had enraged the United States. Sanctions followed, cutting off Japan's access to vital oil and materials. As tension escalated, Yamamoto warned the government again and again. "If I am told to fight, I will run wild for 6 months. But after that, I can promise nothing." His words would soon become prophecy. Despite his reservations, Yamamoto was a soldier. When the emperor gave the order, he obeyed. But inside, he was torn. He knew the war against the West was a gamble Japan could not sustain. Yet, if Japan must strike, he believed, it must do so with precision and speed. Thus was born the plan that would make his name immortal and seal his fate. The attack on Pearl Harbor. In the months leading up to December 1941, Yamamoto hardly slept. In the quiet of his quarters aboard the flagship Nagato, he often sat alone, a cup of tea cooling beside his maps. The Pacific Ocean stretched vast and blue on the charts before him, a chessboard on which the fate of nations would be decided. Every island, every naval base, every shipping lane was burned into his memory. Yet, for all his precision and brilliance, there was a heaviness in his heart. He knew he was designing a blow that would awaken a monster. The plan for Pearl Harbor was unlike anything Japan had ever attempted. It was daring, audacious, and perilously risky. Yamamoto believed that only a sudden, devastating strike could buy Japan enough time to secure its conquests in Asia and negotiate peace from a position of strength. "We must strike like thunder," he told his staff, "and strike first. But if we fail to destroy their will, Japan will be crushed beneath their strength." He spent months perfecting the operation. He studied the harbor's layout, the tides, and the habits of the American fleet. He insisted on training pilots to hit with deadly precision. His obsession with detail was legendary, from the exact depth of the torpedoes to the timing of the attack. He even ordered a full-scale mock-up of Pearl Harbor built in Japan for rehearsals. But in the privacy of his diary, his words were more somber. "The war with America is unwinnable. he wrote. "I am fighting for temporary advantage, not victory." When the attack force finally sailed from Hitokapu Bay in late November 1941, Yamamoto stayed behind. He watched the ships fade into the mist, his expression unreadable. The fleet's radio silence swallowed the sea, and the fate of the empire hung in the cold northern wind. He knew that when those planes struck, there would be no turning back. It was dawn in Hawaii, on the 7th of December 1941. The sun was rising over Diamond Head when the first Japanese planes appeared in the sky. The attack was swift and merciless. Battleships exploded in sheets of flame. Planes were destroyed on the ground, and the air was thick with smoke and screams. In Tokyo, as reports poured in, the nation erupted in joy. The newspapers proclaimed a divine victory. The rising sun had humiliated the West. But on the flagship Nagato, Yamamoto received the news in silence. He bowed his head and murmured a single sentence that revealed everything he felt inside. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He understood America better than any man in Japan. He had walked its streets, listened to its people, and seen its power. He knew that the Americans, once enraged, would not rest until they had exacted vengeance. While politicians celebrated, Yamamoto was already planning for the inevitable counterattack. In the months that followed, Japan's victories were astonishing. From the Philippines to Malaya, the rising sun advanced like wildfire. Yamamoto's fleets dominated the Pacific, his carriers striking with ruthless efficiency. Newspapers hailed him as a genius, a modern-day samurai of the sea. His warning that Japan could run wild for 6 months seemed almost prophetic. But deep down, he knew the truth. Those 6 months were already ticking away. By mid-1942, the American war machine had begun to awaken. Shipyards roared day and night, producing new carriers, bombers, and tanks at a pace Yamamoto knew Japan could never match. The oil reserves Japan had stockpiled were dwindling. For every Japanese pilot lost, America could train 3 more. For every ship sunk, another was being launched. The imbalance was fatal. Yamamoto decided to strike again, this time at Midway, a tiny atoll that he believed would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap. The plan was brilliant on paper: feint, surprise, annihilate. But war, as he knew, rarely followed logic. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway began, and within days, Yamamoto's dreams began to unravel. The Americans, thanks to broken Japanese codes, knew his plan. In a brutal series of battles, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed. Hundreds of veteran pilots were lost. The Imperial Navy's offensive power was shattered in a single blow. When the news reached Yamamoto, he did not rage or cry. He simply removed his cap and stared at the horizon. The prophecy he had once spoken was coming true. Japan had run wild for 6 months, and now the tide had turned. In the privacy of his quarters, he wrote again in his journal, "The Americans are like steel. The more we strike them, the stronger they become. I see now, the end is written." Yet, even in defeat, Yamamoto did not waver in his duty. He reorganized what was left of his fleet, motivated his men, and continued to serve the emperor with unwavering loyalty. But the light in his eyes had dimmed. He fought now, not for victory, but for honor, for a dignified end to an impossible war. As the Pacific War dragged on, Yamamoto's mind often returned to his years in America. He remembered the laughter of students at Harvard, the music echoing from jazz clubs, the gleaming skyscrapers of New York. He thought of the families who had welcomed him into their homes, the baseball games, the freedom of thought and debate. How strange, he mused, that the land he admired most would become the enemy he must destroy. He often wondered what his old friends in America would think of him now, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Would they see him as a monster? Or a soldier caught in history's current? Letters from home brought him little comfort. The Japanese government censored everything, and his family rarely knew where he was. He missed his wife and children dearly, but he never allowed himself to write about sorrow. His life belonged to the sea. Those close to him said he carried a quiet melancholy. He would sometimes walk alone on deck at night, gazing at the stars. "When I was young," he told one aide, "I thought the world was simple, right and wrong, strong and weak. Now I see it is the heart that suffers most in war." Despite his doubts, he remained committed to his duty. He believed that surrender was not an option. If Japan must die, it must die fighting. Yet, beneath the layers of discipline and resolve, he still hoped for a miracle, a chance for Japan to negotiate peace before total destruction. By early 1943, the war was turning disastrous for Japan. The Americans had captured Guadalcanal, and Yamamoto's forces were retreating across the Pacific. Desperate to inspire his troops, he decided to visit frontline bases personally, a dangerous journey deep into contested skies. It was a decision born of honor and fatalism. His staff warned him of the risks, but he refused to hide. "A commander," he said, "must share the dangers of his men." On the 18th of April 1943, Yamamoto boarded his Mitsubishi G4M bomber code named Betty from Rabaul. The morning was calm, the sea below glittering like polished steel. His flight plan had been transmitted in coded form, but American intelligence had already broken the Japanese cipher. In Washington, they intercepted his itinerary, exact time, route, and aircraft. In a daring operation, 16 American P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal, flying 400 miles across open ocean to intercept him. It was one of the longest fighter missions of the war, and its sole objective was to kill one man. At 9:35 a.m., as Yamamoto's bomber descended over the jungle of Bougainville, the American fighters appeared out of the Sunday. The escorting Zero fighters scrambled to defend him, but the ambush was perfect. Tracers ripped through the air, engines screamed, and within seconds, Yamamoto's plane was hit. Flames engulfed the fuselage. It spiraled downward, trailing smoke, before crashing into the dense forest below. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the admiral who had warned Japan of inevitable defeat, was dead. He was 59 years old. When the wreckage was found the next day, Yamamoto's body was still seated upright, his white gloves stained with blood. He had died instantly, a bullet through the head. His staff found his pocket watch stopped at 9:35, the exact moment his prophecy ended. The Japanese military mourned him as a national hero. His ashes were returned to Tokyo, where the people lined the streets in silence as his funeral procession passed. Even his enemies, across the ocean, felt a strange respect. The United States Navy saluted the man they had killed, not as a monster, but as a worthy adversary. For the Japanese people, Yamamoto became a legend, the reluctant warrior who foresaw defeat but still fought with honor. His words, "I will run wild for 6 months, but after that, I can promise nothing," became etched in history as both prophecy and epitaph. In America, many officers later reflected on him with a mix of admiration and irony. They knew that Yamamoto had studied in their country, learned their ways, and perhaps understood them better than anyone else. But understanding, it seemed, had not been enough to change destiny. Yamamoto's legacy is one of paradox. He was both architect and victim of Japan's war, a patriot who hated war, a strategist who foresaw defeat, a man who admired the West, yet fought it to the death. In his mind, loyalty to the emperor outweighed personal conviction, and that loyalty drove him toward tragedy. After the war, as Japan lay in ruins and American soldiers occupied Tokyo, many wondered what might have happened had Japan listened to Yamamoto's warnings. Could the devastation have been avoided? Could diplomacy have prevailed? History offers no answer, only echoes of what might have been. The jungle of Bougainville swallowed the smoke within hours. The flames died out, the wreckage cooled, and the cicadas sang again, indifferent to the death of the man who had once commanded the greatest navy in Asia. Yet from that jungle, a story began to spread, first whispered among pilots, then carried by soldiers, and finally borne across the sea to Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the soul of the Imperial Navy, was gone. When the message reached Tokyo, silence gripped the military headquarters. Officers stood motionless, their faces drained of color. No one dared to speak. To announce Yamamoto's death was to announce that Japan's spirit had been pierced. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo ordered the news to be kept secret until a suitable moment. For weeks, only a handful of men knew the truth. In that time, Japan's front lines continued to crumble, unaware that the man they revered was already dead. When the announcement finally came, the entire nation went into mourning. The emperor himself wept in private. School children bowed before Yamamoto's photograph. Newspapers called him a god of war, a man whose courage would guide Japan even from beyond the grave. Yet behind the words of reverence lay the unspoken truth. Yamamoto's death symbolized not victory, but the beginning of the end. On the 5th of June 1943, Tokyo witnessed one of the most solemn ceremonies in its history. The streets were lined with thousands of mourners. Black flags hung from rooftops. Bells tolled across the city. His ashes, carried in a golden urn draped with the rising sun, were escorted through the capital in a military procession that stretched for miles. Soldiers saluted, women wept, and old veterans stood at attention as the cortege passed. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito personally awarded him a posthumous promotion to Fleet Admiral and the Grand Order of the Chrysanthemum, Japan's highest honor. The emperor's voice trembled as he spoke. Yamamoto gave his life in service of his country, and his spirit will live forever in the heart of our people. But for those who had served under him, grief was mixed with regret. His officers remembered his quiet laughter, his habit of quoting poetry, his endless cigarettes during strategy sessions. They recalled how he once scolded a pilot for cruelty toward a captured enemy, saying, "Courage is not measured by hatred." They remembered a man of discipline and compassion, and a man who had known this war would destroy them. By the summer of 1943, the Pacific had turned red with fire. Without Yamamoto's leadership, Japan's naval command lost direction. The Americans advanced relentlessly from island to island, airfield to airfield. The empire that once stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Aleutians began to shrink under the hammer of U.S. bark, bombers, and carriers. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was informed of the successful mission that killed Yamamoto. He reportedly nodded without celebration and said, "So ends the greatest strategist of the Japanese Navy." Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, remarked later, "He was a worthy enemy, and perhaps the only one among them who truly understood what we were capable of." Yamamoto's prophecy echoed across both nations. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan's dominance had ended at Midway exactly as he predicted. His words became both memorial and warning, quoted by historians, soldiers, and politicians alike. They revealed the depth of his foresight and the futility of the war he could not stop. Among Yamamoto's personal effects, recovered from the crash site, were several letters. Some were addressed to his wife, Reiko, others to his children. Most were unfinished drafts, thoughts he had never dared to send. In one he wrote, "If I do not return, remember that I fought not because I believed we could win, but because honor required that I serve until the end. The sea will keep my secrets, but perhaps someday the waves will tell our story." His wife, a quiet and resilient woman, lived out her life in modest seclusion after the war. She kept his letters in a wooden box beside his medals. Every year, she visited his grave in Tama Cemetery, bowing deeply before the stone that bore his name. To the end of her days, she never spoke ill of the government that sent him to war. Her silence was the silence of an entire generation. In the years after World War II, America's perception of Yamamoto changed from that of an enemy to that of a tragic figure. Former U.S. officers who had met him before the war spoke of his intellect and dignity. In military academies, his strategies were studied as examples of both genius and misjudgment. The brilliance of Pearl Harbor and the fatal overreach of Midway. At Harvard, where he had once walked the campus paths as a foreign student, a few professors still remembered the polite Japanese officer who asked endless questions about industry and democracy. One recalled, "He loved America in his own way. He just loved Japan more." In 1954, an American journalist visiting Japan interviewed an elderly former naval officer who had served with Yamamoto. When asked what kind of man the admiral truly was, the officer smiled faintly and said, "He was a man who knew too much, too soon." Modern Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes of defeat. Factories rose where bomb craters once gaped, and new cities glimmered with neon and hope. The war became memory, and with it, Yamamoto's name took on an almost mythical aura. In textbooks, he was portrayed not as a villain, but as a man trapped by circumstance, the reluctant warrior who saw the truth before anyone else dared. Every April, veterans of the Imperial Navy still gather at his memorial in Nagaoka. They stand in silence before a simple granite monument, offering flowers and sake. The air fills with the sound of distant waves and the rustle of white uniforms. Some whisper his famous warning, others simply bow, their eyes wet with tears they no longer try to hide. Children visiting the site learn how Yamamoto studied abroad, how he warned against war, and how he paid the price of loyalty. Teachers explain that he was both the sword and the conscience of Japan's navy, a man who could not disobey, even when he knew obedience would destroy them all. History often remembers warriors for their victories. Yamamoto is remembered for his warning. His words, "I can run wild for 6 months," are quoted not only by historians, but by politicians and generals who study the cost of pride. They remind the world that even the greatest intellect cannot escape the momentum of nations blinded by ambition. He understood that modern war was no longer about bravery or divine favor. It was about fuel, steel, factories, and time. America had all of them. Japan had courage, but courage alone could not power ships or build planes. In this, he was not only a naval strategist, but a prophet of the new age of warfare, where industrial might and economic endurance would define victory. Had Yamamoto's warnings been heeded, perhaps Japan might have taken a different path, one of diplomacy, modernization, and coexistence. But destiny rarely bends to wisdom. In the rising tide of nationalism and pride, his voice was drowned out by the roar of cannons. On quiet evenings, when the sun sets over the Pacific, sailors still speak of Yamamoto as though he never truly died. They say his spirit sails with the winds that sweep across the ocean he loved. They imagine him standing on the deck of an invisible ship, hat in hand, watching the horizon where sea and sky become one. In that endless expanse, perhaps he finally found peace, far from politics, beyond nations, beneath the same stars he once studied as a young officer. The stars that guided his fleet still shine over both Japan and America, binding the two nations that once destroyed each other in war, yet later found reconciliation in peace. There is a haunting beauty in that symmetry. The country Yamamoto admired became Japan's post-war mentor. The enemy he warned against became its closest ally. The prophecy of destruction was followed by an era of rebirth. Perhaps, in some way, that was his final victory, that Japan would learn, through suffering, the truth he had known all along, that wisdom is greater than pride, and that no nation wins by misunderstanding its enemy. Isoroku Yamamoto's story is more than a chronicle of battles and strategy. It is a meditation on loyalty, foresight, and tragedy. He was a man who stood at the crossroads of two civilizations, the East that raised him, and the West that taught him. His years in America opened his eyes to the future. His years in Japan bound him to the past. Between them, he was torn until the end. In life, he served his emperor. In death, he serves as a warning to all who would mistake boldness for wisdom. The ocean that claimed his body remains silent, but its waves still carry his lesson. That power, without understanding, is ruin, and that even the mightiest empire can crumble within 6 months of arrogance. As the last light fades over the Pacific, the name Yamamoto lingers whispered by the sea, remembered by history, and immortalized by his own prophecy.